Tonight, I want to introduce the panel that will be participating in the discussions tonight. To my left is Gene Goldman. Gene was the Shuttle Main Engine Project Manager. He was also the Director of the Stennis Space Center, the Deputy Director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, and Acting Director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. He currently is Executive Director of Aerojet Rocketdyne Huntsville Operations. The next, on the far end, is Keith Henson. Keith was the manager of the solid rocket motor for many years. He was also the manager of the solid rocket booster recovery system and is currently senior consultant with Lee and Associates and Jacobs Engineering. Parker Counts in the middle of our panel. Parker was the manager of the solid rocket booster and also project manager for the external tank. He also was Deputy Associate Administrator for the Space Shuttle program, and he's a senior consultant for BAE Systems and Ball Aerospace. Now, the format tonight is I'm going to be asking each of the panel members to respond to questions that I have written up, and after we've gone through several of those before we run out of time, I want to open questions up to the audience. So as we go through the discussion, be thinking of any questions that you would like to ask this panel as we get into our program. So starting with that, I'm going to ask the first question, and it is, what do you consider to be the key ingredients essential to managing a successful program or project? And I'll start with Gene on this one.
Appreciate all of you being here tonight, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to be here. Yeah, there are a lot of elements in being a program or project manager, leader, and you'll hear different opinions, but to me, some of the key ones are the ability to have two-way communication, to have outstanding listening skills, and to be inclusive. When you're leading a team that is multidisciplined and as many different personalities as we had in the shuttle program, you have to be able to get along with people. You have to be able to get people to work together. And to me, in order to do that, you have to first listen to them, hear what their views are, and then make decisions about those views. As a project manager, you're always the person who is the most accountable for the success of that team, but making sure that you have an outstanding and a well-functioning team is the key.
Parker.
Well, I think there's three things that I learned early on in the program that it took to be a successful project manager. And number one was schedule. You got to maintain the schedule of where you're going. Secondly, you've got to build margin into your programs, and certainly you've got to manage the cost. So cost and schedule becomes very critical as far as elements of the key program management. Now, Gene hit on one of the key ones, and that is the working with the team. If you don't have a good team, you don't have that. But you've got to do that. One other thing is you have to build margins into your program. Learn very early that if you don't have some margins in your budget, if you don't have some margins in your schedule, you have to commit to a program, commit to a schedule, and then many of us, we had to commit to what was called a program commitment agreement. And to do that, then you had to put on paper what you would do. And as we many times laughed about it, we had one shot as a project manager. If you didn't make it the first time, you had one recovery. After that, you were gone. So that holds true in a lot of cases. But you do have to have that margin. But I think it's cost and schedule and performance. You have to have those three parameters meeting those requirements. But how you do that is you build it through a team. And I could echo what, again, Gene says, because without the people talking to one another, not only the program side, you got to work it through engineering, you got to work it through your quality and reliability assurance, and you got to work it through procurement. So you got all those disciplines to consider.
Okay, Keith?
Well, Gene and Parker enumerated quite a bit of the generic aspects of trying to be successful. I'll add one personality aspect to it, I think, which I think is critical to what we did, what we had to do. Each of these flight programs, each of these flight hardware programs have a certain personality and a certain individual set of sensitivities and threats associated with them. The engine had certain ones, the tank had certain ones. The motor came from a little different aspect. We could not 100% acceptance test a given set of flight hardware, a given flight rocket motor. So our focus and our threat was our manufacturing process. Solid rocket motor is kind of like a flash bulb. You can't test the one that you're going to put in the camera and take the picture with. You got to believe it based on the manufacturing process, and you've got to assure excellence in the manufacturing process. So a lot of our challenges were getting the right kind of skills and the right kind of focus and the right kind of regimentation and consistency on the manufacturing process, which was the particular threat for that set of hardware. So successful management, depending on each guy figuring out where's the weak spot, where have I got to focus, and where have I got to be sure the right skills are looking. So I'll add that to the generic points that the guys made.
I wonder if we could turn the volume up on the mics. I understand it's hard to hear in the rear of the room. So while Joseph is coming down, I'll pose the next question for the guys to think about. And that question is, what was the biggest management challenge you faced in managing your project?
Well, that one's an easy question for me. I think the most challenging assignment we had was when we built the super lightweight tank on the external tank. It was a third generation improvement. I guess many of us didn't realize it, and I've seen several tank folks here in the audience, and they can correct me where I'm wrong, but I think they can share with me because that was a challenging assignment. But we were given the assignment to take 7,500 pounds of weight savings out of the external tank. It was necessary to take that weight savings in order to provide the shuttle the payload capability to get the International Space Station to the new orbit that was politically arranged with Russia to meet in the 52 inclination orbit. So we didn't realize we were under that pressure because we hadn't developed that weight savings. We could have probably taken down the shuttle and taken down the space station. So a great challenge, and certainly I have to tell you that that was the challenge that faced all of us in the tank project at that time in the mid-90s. The good news is after several issues we overcame, and there were many, weldability of aluminum lithium as well as repairing it. Many other things faced us. We lost the recipe for aluminum lithium, and it's not a fun thing to do when you're building a tank and you can't even build the product that you need. But we overcame that. But we finished the program on schedule, on time, and with a $20 million under budget, which was a bit unusual. And that was an accomplishment no projects has done yet, but I think it's one we want to, as a team, take credit for. And I think we provided the performance. We didn't get much over, and Mike Pessin can probably give you the exact numbers, but we met our 7,500 pound weight savings, and I think that was a challenge we faced, and it was a wonderful opportunity, and it ended with the good news.
Keith?
Well, solid rocket motors again. When I think about the biggest challenges that hit me over the 9 years that I participated in that endeavor, I think of the short-term, quickie, big ones, and I think of the longer-term, oh my Lord, it never gets over type. In terms of the longer-term, it never gets over type. For the solid rocket motor, it was obsolescence. Solid rocket motor is made up of a bunch of chemistry inside and a bunch of adhesives inside. All of that's bought from industry, and lo and behold, all along the way, everybody go out of business, and we'd have to find a new adhesive and a new chemical constituent, whatever. And then you got to meet the schedule and dance through all the hoops to try to be sure you don't foul this thing up and get the obsolescence in the design and get it to fly. So the major challenge all along the way was trying to overcome all of those obsolescence things, and they were forever. In terms of short-term ones, which has to do with launch pressure, I was at the Cape somewhere in the early 90s, and one of the gates we had to get through for every launch relative to the solid rocket motor was complete the look back at the previous flight set, and anything that was in there that looked the least bit out of ordinary, we had to figure out what that was and what it meant relative to the next one going to the pad. And there was a period of time in the 90s when we launched almost one a month for 12 months. So we were getting one back, trying to figure out what we had, trying to figure out what we'd do with it, and trying to get on the launch pad. The sequence down at the Cape to get on the launch pad is L-2, L-1, and launch. We had to justify to the mission management team that we were ready to go on L-2, 24 hours later, ditto again for L-1, and then launch the next day. I had just got through with our project's presentation at L-2 and went outside for a rest break, meeting still going on. I had just made the statement, we're good to go. And when I got outside, I had a telephone message, call Utah. I called Utah and they told me the phenolics in the nozzle, which is the insulator in the nozzle for the previous flight set, were laying in the floor in the manufacturing facility. So I had to go back in the mission management team and tell them, we're not ready to go. We have no idea what that is. We got to figure it out, and we'll have to hopefully see where we come tomorrow and tell you guys what we can do with it. But in terms of short term, oh my Lord, what the cat hair are we going to do with that? That was the biggest one.
Gene?
For me, it was during the return to flight after Columbia. And prior to Columbia, we had implemented the high-pressure LOX pumps and high-pressure fuel pumps, and these pumps were designed to make 10 flights before you had to tear them down. And during the flight hiatus following Columbia, we brought some pumps back and tore them down early, one at seven starts. And there's a very, very small part in the pump that had some cracks in some of the teeth. Now, these parts were extremely small. If you can imagine something that looked like a comb with 4 very, very short teeth that acts as a seal, and we had cracks. And so we brought back subsequent units. Some of those also had cracks, and it became a thing where the only units which had been cracked had flight time on them, and our development and certification units did not have those same cracks. And so there was concern in the community, especially at JSC, that possibly it was something about the flight environment that was causing the cracking. And we were trying to resolve that problem and show that we were ready to go with the first units on return to flight a year after the accident, or in 2005. Having to show that, one, identify the problem and that we had adequate flight rationale to show that the pumps that we were flying were okay. Working that through the engineering community at Marshall, and then especially working that through the flight community at JSC. For those of you who know John Young, who was one of our astronauts, he's the one who had posed the question about it possibly being the flight environment. And it was extremely difficult getting it through those wickets. What we ultimately found out was that there was a slight difference between a design drawing and a manufacturing drawing that had to do with a small radius and how you put it on that edge of the tooth. And that very subtle difference was just enough to make the configuration of those units such that it endured or had cracking caused just after several starts. We had to recertify units to demonstrate that we could get 3 flights and then ultimately 4 flights, and sometime after left the program they'd gotten it up to 5 flights. But getting through that process at a time when, following Columbia, we had to have 9 assets ready for each launch, 3 for the primary launch, 3 in case we had to do an emergency rescue, and 3 engines to back up that emergency rescue vehicle. So balancing those flight assets while we were resolving the knife edge seal issue was certainly my biggest problem.
Thank you, guys. The next question is, how does one learn to be an effective project manager? This is somewhat related to the first question on the key ingredients essential to managing, but how did you learn to be an effective project manager, and what are the most important factors to achieve success? And I'll start with Keith on that one.
Well, I truly believe that diversifying your activities in the earlier part of your career is a huge contributor to that. In our world, that we have dealt with, space program, flight systems, that kind of thing. Technical issues and resolution of technical issues is the backbone, of course. And learning some of the tricks of the trade of dealing with technical issues, you get that in your first 1 or 2 assignments of your career. And if you learn the tricks of the trade, they kind of apply across the different disciplines. The approaches to doing that are somewhat consistent. The arithmetic and the Bernoulli's equation might be different, but the approach is about the same. So you go through that, and then if you're blessed, like I was blessed by somebody deciding that I should go be a budget manager, and he's in the room today, and I thank him for that, although it was kind of challenging there for a year and a half. But anyway, you go get some budget experience, because that's critical also. And if you can do that, that sets you up to be able to have an appreciation and an intuition and a feel for resources and how to function appropriately in that ball game. So I think the first part of your career, you try to get diversified skills, and then the second thing you try to do is identify a good mentor, identify some management folk that you are impressed by, and you watch and listen. I think that's the next critical thing you do. So if you add A plus B, I think you got a good chance.
Hey, Gene?
I believe Keith nailed it. Diversity of experience is one of is to me the major factor, that budget experience. In industry now, I think of all the assignments that I wish I had had while I was working for the government that would make my job easier now. But within NASA, Parker one time told me never turn down a job, and I don't think I turned down but maybe one. You learn something from each one of those jobs. I look back on my entire career and the construction work that I did before I ever came to NASA, and that need to be able to work with people to identify problems and then be able to implement it to meet those factors Parker talked about earlier, but primarily to be able to integrate a solution with all of the different people that are involved in it, because inevitably as a project manager, you're responsible for pulling that together. Early in your career as a task engineer or a task manager, you have a similar task. It's just not at the same scale, but it's getting everything to come together. And to me, the principle that Dr. Von Braun and his team had of automatic accountability, that if you identified a problem, even if it wasn't in your area of responsibility, until you got that problem to the person who was responsible and they accepted it, it was yours. And to me, that's a key ingredient of being a successful project manager, is that desire to be accountable, that knowledge that you're most accountable for your program.
Thanks, Gene.
And I, too, was very blessed in having the opportunity to come work for NASA. But the thing that I remember was that as a fresh-out engineer and coming to work in mid-Apollo was that that first job I had was ever so exciting, so I kept working it. And I wanted to be the best, and I wanted to stay right there. I wanted to be whatever it was, making schematics for the shuttle or the Saturn or whatever. But I had a mentor. I had a boss that was so very good to me, because he would challenge me. I moved from that one. He said, go over here and do electrical components. Well, I had nothing to do and hated electrical engineering when I was in school, so I had to go into electrical. And then he sent me over to another spot. So after that third move, what unbeknown to me, but after over the years, I became quite confident that, well, if I can do these, then I can move forward and I can take on other challenges. So I thought it was good to have the mentorship, but the diversity of skills that both Gene and Keith mentioned are okay. Now, one thing I didn't have is, contrary to what Keith and Gene had, was budget experience. I somehow avoided that in my career move, but the best thing I did was to be sure I had a great program control office, and I had the best in the world, and they kept me out of trouble, so I didn't have to end up with a budget. And then finally, I think to be successful in this, we got to go back. It's not an individual thing, it's a team effort, and if you do not be able to communicate with the folks, both your engineering support as well as your quality and reliability assurance support, your budget folks, you know, you've got to be able to develop that skill to be successful.
Thanks, Parker. The next question is, what was one of the more humorous events you recall as a project manager? And I'll start with you, Gene.
It's funny to me now. During return to flight, before we flew the first time following Columbia, in getting ready for that first launch within Space Shuttle main engine, we had a, I'm not sure if it was a written rule, but we had a project manager's rule that we did not do a test firing at Stennis within 24 hours of a flight. Because, as Keith mentioned earlier, that finding an anomaly and being able to develop flight rationale before the flight, you didn't want to go through that. Well, coming up on the first flight after Columbia and the time frame that we had been down, I didn't want us to find anything in the last week. And Stennis, who sometimes tests on a regular schedule and sometimes on their own schedule, had some tests coming up that they wanted to do. So I imposed a 5-day stand down on testing, but I didn't announce that I had done that. And so I sent a note to the test team at Stennis, a friend of mine, and just a handful of other people explaining why I wanted to hold off on testing. And in that note, I put, and I put it in quotation marks to say I'm just kidding about this, but I used that my fear as a project manager of being the person that stood in the way of first flight if we identified an anomaly was the reason I was asking them to do this. So I sent the note, and within an hour, I started getting back responses from people that I had not sent the note to. And I went to a meeting and came back, and Carol, my assistant, told me that I had a call from Aviation Week. And so I had panic go through me because I figured that this note, which had got forwarded because they didn't realize the sensitivity of it, had found its way to one of our reporters, and that they wanted to talk to me about this fear I had as a project manager of flying the shuttle. Fortunately, it wasn't. They were just wanting to get a status, and I squelched the email where it was. But that was a really good lesson in if you put something in an email, generally, if you say it, the wrong person is going to see it or hear it, and that news travels really, really fast.
Okay, Parker.
I guess my experience, the one I remember is most humorous, probably more embarrassing to me than it was humorous to a lot of other folks. But we used to celebrate something in our shuttle. All of us as project managers had a morning call at 7:30 in the morning. We were tied in across the loop from Kennedy and Johnson, Stennis, and Washington. So we were always there doing it. This happened to be Boss's Day. And I mentioned earlier I had the privilege of having a great business office, but most of that business office, I was reminded Saturday on the NASA on the Square that I had 6 ladies in that group, and several of them were there. Well, what these ladies had done was to come in dressed up as men, mustaches, ties, and fix their hair. They really looked like gentlemen and good-looking men, I guess, but they came into the midst of this shuttle teleconference and with pink highlighters in their pockets sat there at the door, and I was the brunt of the joke because I was the guy that was the manager that had all the ladies, and they had turned against me in the Boss's Day. So it was, I think, embarrassing, but I think a lot of the guys got a laugh out of it.
Well, Gerald, I don't know where you got this question.
You got a lot of stories.
Well, to me, the funny stuff was what somebody said at some profound moment, and there's bunches of them over my 10 years with the motor program and so forth, and they're only funny if you can appreciate a couple of aspects. One is they all happened at a profound moment when the environment was serious. The previous 1 to 6 hours was under duress, and all of a sudden, this gentleman of renown would come out with something, and it would just be a bottom filler. For instance, we were putting together flight readiness charts, and we were up against the gun because it was short again, and everybody was just sitting there, hurry, hurry, hurry. And one of the priceless gentlemen out in Utah, who Gerald knows very well, George Alford, a gentleman beyond all gentlemen. And the storm could be going on, and George would just kind of sit there. And he was doing it on this particular moment, and somebody looked over at him and said, "George, we got to hurry." And George looked up and he says, "What do you mean hurry? I'm sitting here fast as I can." I just busted the place up. And then I was in the ninth floor many years ago, way before my day, so to speak, and Dr. Lucas was chairing activities, and he asked, I won't go into any names because it's a scream anyway, but he asked a gentleman in the room for an opinion on a technical point, and he went into quite a description of it. And he stopped, and it involved Rocketdyne. And Dr. Lucas turned around and looked at a fellow from Rocketdyne and says, well, what do you think about this? And that fellow went into a diatribe, and he got through. And Dr. Lucas looked back around at the Marshall fellow and says, "That's not what you said." And the phrase came back, "Dr. Lucas, that's exactly what I meant to say."
Very good. Next question. What do you consider your greatest accomplishment and your worst misstep or mistake as a project manager? And let's see it. We're to, who took the first one? I think you do, Keith. Yeah.
Okay, greatest accomplishment. Well, I think all of us would say, we've all felt good about, A at one time, and then 5 years later, B, it feels really good, maybe, hopefully, if you're doing all right. And 5 years later, something else. So I don't know how you totem pole all those, but along my pathway, there were several, thank goodness. And the first one of real substance to me was when I had the parachute responsibility on STS-1 in the shuttle program, and lo and behold, them suckers floated out there in the Atlantic Ocean, and we got them. And them suckers weighed 160,000 pounds, and there'd never been a parachute do that. And we drank a coup that night. It was a good day. The other two relate to shuttle launches, of course. I mentioned earlier, there was a period of time during my tenure when we essentially launched one a month there for about 10 or 12 months. And looking back on that, in the immediate aftermath on it, you just thought, how in the world did we live through all that smoke and fire and just have everything be good? So that was a great one. And then when I look and say, well, I managed to do that 10 years, and I had great people that were around me, and just having those great people to be a part of was a big deal.
Hey, Gene?
Mine, I took over from Mr. George Hobson when he moved on to another section following Columbia. George had a great team in place, but I felt like my greatest accomplishment was taking that team and formalizing, and by formal I don't mean documentation, but I mean treating all parts of that team with equal emphasis. In particular, the laboratory support that we had. The labs and engineering at Marshall are the backbone of the center and the backbone of the project. And there was, I'll just say, a casual relationship with the labs. We worked very hard post-Columbia to formalize that, to make the labs feel a part of what we were doing, and that what they said mattered. That from a technical standpoint, when they had a technical position, that it counted what they were saying to the program manager, project manager, and that it wasn't just, the final answer was not going to be couched in we have to meet schedule or we have to meet budget. It was going to be in we have to do this We have to do this right. And there are a lot of issues that don't have a right or wrong answer. And it's really easy to tell the engineering people that, sorry, we have to do it this way, and it's never their way. And that, I believe, greatly enhanced what was already a really good team, but I felt like that brought it closer together. Misstep or mistake, and this isn't related to the humorous incident I said, but it was my belief that as we report up the ladder, that what we say goes up to the next level with the same context and importance that we had conveyed it. Post-Columbia, we had, between the project managers and the shuttle program manager, we had a marshal manager. And the position was we would report to the marshal manager, who would convey our thoughts to the program manager. My belief at the time was the project manager should be the person doing that, certainly with the marshal manager's understanding, but the responsibility for the project was mine for Space Shuttle Main Engine, just as these other element managers. That was a little bit different relationship than we had prior to Columbia. And I had to go back to the shuttle program manager on a couple of instances and explain something that had been told to him. And I didn't feel the project manager should be put in that position. I don't think they should ever be put in that position. We respect the management structure, but as project manager, when you say we are go for flight, it's you that are putting your career on the line and putting the lives of the crew on the line. And having that responsibility, I believe you should have the option of having your say with those people that you report to.
Well, certainly, I think the greatest accomplishment that I share with the external tank team was the completion of the super lightweight tank. It was a third generation design. My great friend Jim Odom took the easy, low-hanging fruit out and took 10,000 pounds out of this tank. And then we came along with the second generation and took some more. Now they were the third generation, and there was nothing left to handle. So we had to reinvent the design and find a new material, and then make that material work and qualified. But as I said earlier, that all came together so very nicely. So that was something that, as a team, we were quite proud of. Mistake, I might. Keith mentioned Dr. Lucas, and I mentioned it also affectionately. But I had one early in my career, and I was sent out to Rocketdyne to go look at. We had a mixed weld wire problem. Somehow there was some weld wire that got mixed up, and it got in. And the engine is made up of a significantly large number of welds, and so I was part of the reliability and quality assurance organization at the time, and was charged to go out there and find out what happened. Well, I came back and I was to brief Dr. Lucas. I knew we found out what happened. The weld wires got mixed up. But the mistake I made, it was a simple choice of a word, and many of you work for NASA. I know Dr. Lucas is pretty clear, but I responded to one of his questions that, Dr. Lucas, that's academic, and then I didn't get that word out until he told me to sit down. So not only was it embarrassing, but it was the one mistake I learned. But I have to say, from that I learned to choose my words much more carefully.
Next question, and this goes back to something Gene just said. Who do you believe should be held totally accountable for a given program or project? And Parker, I'll start with you on that.
That was which question, Gerald?
It's question 7. Who do you believe should be held totally accountable for a given program or project?
Certainly, it's got to start with the project manager. Gene clearly and eloquently shared that with you, but you have to you have to be accountable. It's your life. It's your decisions that finally have to deal with in human space flight, what's on the crew, and whatever happens to you. But you've got to develop that carefully. You've got to carefully run through those decisions before you make them. You don't make them quickly. You make them with judgment. You make them with consulting the engineering directorate, your other team members, and you have to doing it. But it does become, I think you'll see from all three of us, and you heard it from Gene, it is the program and our project manager of that element.
Okay, Keith?
Well, yeah, I think the answer's obviously the project manager. He's got to hold that mantle. There's another gentleman that serves quite well and serves critically in that endeavor, the space program hardware endeavors at Marshall, and that's the chief engineer. He is also extremely in an accountability position relative to the technical aspects, but that doesn't diminish the project manager's ultimate responsibility. But he does get to call upon that expertise to help him share. So I think that is kind of the bottom line, Gerald.
Gene, I think you talked to that, but
I did, and if I could wait, because I agree with what Parker and Keith said, and especially that relationship between the project manager and the chief engineer. I had the benefit of seeing George Hobson and Lynn Worland share that responsibility, and it was fun to me to just sit and listen to them talk engine problems. Joe Shea was the Apollo program manager when the Apollo 1 fire occurred, and he had made a comment about, as program manager, you can't know every possible detail that you're responsible for, but you are responsible for putting in place a system that assures that nothing will fall in a crack. And that's a really hard thing to do, but so obviously project manager.
okay. I'm now going to open it up to any questions from the audience.
Who was someone that you guys worked with very early on? Who was someone that really
The question, I think, I don't believe everybody can hear that. Who did they work for that maybe a mentor earlier in their career that really helped them in their career?
Well, I'll take a stab since I mentioned it was early in my career that I had a supervisor. That happened to be Charlie Clark by name. He's deceased now, but he was one of the early on folks, but he was a branch chief. And he's the one that challenged me in every step. He just put his hand on me and moved me around in the various sections of his branch. And that was very meaningful to me very early in my career. After that, I had, several others that I would go with, and we had many at the center. So, but it is early, but that, as a name you asked for, that was the one that was significant to me.
Well, and in my case, it was George Hardy and Bill Horton. And I think there's a lot of people in this room that know those two gentlemen, and they were unbelievable in their perception and in their integrity. And you could observe it all along the way, and it really influenced my pathway. George is another one that I was alluded to some quotes earlier about humorous stuff. And I can't help but tell this one because it was priceless to me. The solid rocket booster back in the 70s when it was being developed, the critical skill shortage was stress and strain work. The structures work wasn't keeping up, and it became a big deal. So they had a major review, and that was in the days when a lot of them smoked, and the room was, the smoke was down to here, and everybody's peeking under it, and it started at 7 o'clock in the morning, and somewhere around 9:30 at night, it kind of reached fruition, and it was a schedule, resources, what do we work first, what do we work second, how do we get there from here type of meeting. And Horton was sitting up there, and Hardy was sitting over here, and it all got to the end, and the pregnant pause happened, and everybody's sitting there waiting on Hardy to speak. And Hardy sat there for a minute or two, and he says, well, it doesn't make any difference where you start or what path you take. When you get there you are. you just got to learn from them kind of things, guys, and it really can help you along the way.
I had a lot of them. I was lucky to come to Shuttle at a time when these gentlemen were project managers. Gerald was down at Stennis. I got to watch a lot of them, but in two in particular, the ones I just mentioned were George Hobson and Lynn Worland for completely different reasons. A lot of people that know George and know I was his deputy for some time and presume that I had a lot of sessions at the knees of George to have him explain to me how the world worked. I learned more from George by what he did not say than things that he said, and he said a lot of profound things. And Lynn Worland, just to have dinner with him was a lesson in how you managed. He made the comment one night, Gene, your boss is always evaluating your performance, and that always stuck with me. So,
Any other questions before I knock this off? Well, we've got a little bit of time. I've got a few, oh, back there, okay.
Hi. Congress has given NASA a couple of deadlines for the space launch system. You know, they want it to launch for the first time in 2017. They want it to launch again in 2021. And, you know, all the folks are working really, really hard to make those deadlines. And I just wonder, you know, what effect does it have on the folks working in a program and the people managing the program to have a deadline like that looming ahead of you? You know, you got to meet this deadline, but you've also got to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. I mean, how do you deal with something like that?
Who wants to jump in there?
Yeah, you pray a lot. Well, I ended up with only Mike, so I'll share with these guys. But I think, yes, you have to have the deadlines. The deadlines are there. You work against them. And in the case of where we were with the tank, where we had to make it, we had to beat the Russians to. They were breaking the first module, and then to get to that orbit, it would have been an embarrassment to the country to not be able to make it. So the pressure was there. We probably didn't feel it. We were off nose to the grindstone trying to make the milestones, but you have to have that challenge to doing it. And I'll share this with you because it was Tommy Holloway, our program manager at the time, and speaking to the deadlines and on that, we had exhausted everything in order to make, you say SLS, the 2017 launch, well, we had a December launch of whatever year that was, back in '98. We had a December launch, and we'd pulled out all the stops. We were on 24/7, 7 days a week. We had cut all the processing time at the Kennedy Space Center down. They had done everything they could to qualify the tank for this first flight, and we were out of time. And I called Tommy and told him, I says, Tommy, I'm gonna have to declare that we cannot meet the December launch date. And maybe the praying comes into effect here a little bit, but Tommy's response to me back was, Parker, hold your breath because the Russians aren't going to have the module ready in time. So we held our breath and came out. And then later he qualified. He didn't say. He says, now you owe the Russians a case of vodka.
Keith?
Well, I think that sets the stage, that situation that you've suggested sets the stage for along the way, NASA management having to step up to the tough one, because along the way, if you can't get there from here, then they have to get some relief, either schedule or finances, more resources to be able to accelerate, or some relief in schedule to get there, because the alternative of getting there inadequately or insufficiently is not on the table. So that's one of those major challenges that the NASA management continually has to face.
yeah, but it's the scheduled deadline that causes the program to focus. The agency has to set those deadlines with some understanding of what it's going to take to get there, but then that's where the project manager has to step up and show the leadership to drive, and drive's probably not the right word, but you have to breach the particular deadline, or you have to explain early that you're not going to be able to make the deadline. And as Keith said, getting there insufficiently is not an option, but without that deadline, you never get there. I worked nuclear plants for 13 years, and as soon as you slipped fuel load 6 months, you had slipped it a year.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Younger people, such as our space camp cadets, or those just coming out of college, going through college, trying to get in with NASA or some more technical fields, and how to be successful at a young age?
mine is learn everything you can. You come into these positions, you come through school, you get basically the same education most everyone's getting, and I believe all of us wish we could go back and have our college years over to learn more once we know. But it's not academic learning. Once you get into your job, it's being exposed to those mentors, to the people, watching those people and how they do their job, learning from that. We think in terms of what technical assignment do I get that I get the most benefit from. It's watching the interaction of the leadership team, of the engineering team, of how you do teamwork. And then how do you make yourself, how do you get the opportunities to be part of that team such that once you do, you step into that role and function working with other people. It's Parker's advice, don't ever turn down a job, and go into that job regardless of how crummy a job it seems at the time, that there's some pearl you're going to get from that will help you in your career.
And I would just add that it's incumbent also, another take on it is it's incumbent on us as that have been so blessed in working in this program and seeing the successes we've had. We've got to share that with that younger generation. If we're not willing to go out and tell others and tell the space campers or encourage others to doing it, I think we've got a story to tell, and we need to go do that to the younger and encourage them in whatever pursuit they want, and share the experiences we've had so that they've got an understanding of where they want to go and how they want to develop their career.
Well, a comment that relates to, I think, the topic you're hinting at, not how do you get started, so to speak, with NASA, but what are some of the benchmarks for trying to select your early jobs if you have option 1, 2, or 3? And I think in my years, I believe I saw a lot of people, a lot of guys and gals make mistakes with that, because I saw a lot of them that tried to pick the job based on the cosmetic of the organization chart, as opposed to pick the job that gives you some responsibility and has a product that you enjoy producing, because that's the way you make progress in your career, having a job that has a responsibility. So think about that when you're choosing, because if you pick the one that cosmetically looks good on the org chart, it may not serve you well as some other.
Very good. Pardon, just a minute, Mike.
The thing that hasn't been brought out is that heavily contributing to the success of any project manager is having an exceptional contractor. No project manager can heal an incompetent contractor, but a very competent contractor can salvage a poor project manager.
So true.
I think all three of us agree with you, Mike, and we didn't bring out the contractors that went, but when we mentioned our teams, that team clearly included the contractors throughout the shuttle program. But Mike's point is very well taken, because you can either be made or broken if you, depending on the responses of your contractor teammates.
Okay, I want to ask another question, since it's relevant to these three guys. What's it like to work for a space contractor after you work for NASA? And all three of them have worked for the contractors now since they finished their career. And let me just start with Gene.
To me, it's very interesting to go into industry, and there are a lot of facets of that role that are completely different than what I had on the NASA side. But one of the biggest lessons that I've learned in government, we would hear a lot that they wouldn't put up with this, that, or the other in industry. They just wouldn't have it. Well, apparently they haven't seen the part of industry that I've seen. We do both. The government and the contractor side do things good, and we do things poorly. It's just usually different things.
Well, it's entirely different. There is a different perspective when you get on the contractor side, and you look at things a bit differently than we would in the government. But I would add that I was, again, fortunate with, well, J.R. Thompson by name is a mentor, but is also one that sent me to Rocketdyne early in my career. We were having trouble getting it was the Space Shuttle main engine was the pacing item at the time. But that gave me 3 years as an assignment in the Contractors facility, and I think is part of another developing or the skills you develop. Walking and being in that early in my career to be in a Contractors plant, although a government representative, taught me an awful lot about seeing what happens and what they have to go through. So it's an interesting way. So that's a balance that you need, and if you have that opportunity as advice to others, I think an assignment in a Contractors plant in a government's career, government employee's career is beneficial.
Well, Gerald, I've never really been lined with industry. My post-NASA thing is consulting, so I probably don't have as broad a opinion as these other guys here have about that comparison. But I would submit that if you've spent some time with NASA and then you went to industry, my observation would be you could appreciate and would appreciate more what NASA needs relative to a product and a justification of a product in order for the program or whatever the endeavor is you're dealing with to survive. So I would believe that NASA first and them second, it would at least yield that to you in your pathway of trying to be successful in industry.
Any further questions? I've been very quiet because many of these questions I'd be interested in answering them, but I want to talk the one that we just talked about. In my career, when I was at Thiokol, where the solid rocket motors are being built, the push was to satisfy your customer, and that was first and foremost. But as I got into some of the contractor flight readiness reviews, I would hear, well, this is what Keith Henson wants. And I would say, is that what we want? As a contractor, we have a responsibility to the project manager to make recommendations of things that we feel are important. And even if it doesn't agree with maybe what we interpret the project manager at Marshall to be, we've got the responsibility to tell him. Now, once we've done that, and we presented our case as thoroughly and as completely as possible, should he decide to do something different, then fine, we're going to satisfy the customer, because he's ultimately the customer. But this idea of trying to make sure that we're responsive is very important, but you don't want to abdicate that responsibility as a contractor to not tell your project manager what really you feel needs to be done on the project. So with that, we're about out of time. I want to thank the panel for being here and all of you for attending, and thank you very much.